everyone. Thanks for attending this virtual event organized by Word Up Community Bookshop. During this event, feel free to add comments in the chat panel, which can be accessed by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen. If you have questions, click the Q&A button and put them there, just so the questions don't get lost in the chat. And if you don't know Word Up, we're a community bookshop, an art space run by local residents, most of whom are volunteers. We can be found at 2113 Amsterdam Avenue at the corner of 165th Street in Washington Heights, New York. We host events for all ages and sell used and new books in English and Spanish. And you can check us out at wordupbooks.com. I'll put the link in the chat. We do ship books all across the country. So you can buy books and we'll ship them to you. And yeah, thanks for coming to this event. I'm going to pass it on to Mery Diaz, who's an associate professor of human services at New York City College of Technology in CUNY. She studies BIPOC students' schools experiences from K to higher education using narrative approaches. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Ben and I, Ben Shepard, who's the co-editor of the book. We've been really thinking about hosting these events, and we are so happy to be hosted by Word Up Community Bookstore, which is the community bookstore in my neighborhood in Washington Heights. So we're excited that you are joining us, and we're also excited to have 3 of the authors who contributed to the collection of stories here with us. And I'm going to introduce them. There were a total of 18 chapters in the book, and 3 of the authors who contributed are here, and Erica Goldblatt Hyatt, who is an associate teaching professor and assistant director of the doctoral program in social work at Rutgers University. She is nationally recognized for her work in the area of grief and loss, reproductive justice, and the promotion of narrative in social work practice. Her chapter in the book is titled Shifting Identities, Shifting Meanings, Adolescent Siblings and Grief. We also have with us Trevor Milton, who is an assistant professor of sociology and criminal justice at Queensborough Community College in CUNY. He studies prison reform, adolescent criminal behavior, and informal economic practices. He is the author of Overcoming the Magnetism of Street Life, Crime-Engaged Youth, and the Programs That Transform Them. His chapter in the book is titled Neighborhood Surveillances and the Prison Assembly Line. We also have Stephen Rushek, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Montclair State University. He studies immigration, education, and cities. His chapter is titled Dreaming Despite Status, Immigrant Youth in Contingent Migration Context. I'd like to thank you all for participating in our conversation today. I know that kind of organizing yourselves around these talks or these events can be really tricky, especially for those of all of us are parents. Some of us have very little kids, so they might make some cameos or scream in the backgrounds. That's just the reality for us, but hopefully they'll let us have this hour and 15-minute without too much action. Before moving on to hear from the authors and their chapters and the youth stories within, Ben and I would like to tell you a little bit about how this book came to be. I'll start and then I'll pass the baton to Ben. So Ben and I worked together at City Tech, and we often talked about the powers of stories and conveying meaning from the human experiences to our students. Sometimes we found it really difficult to convey social problems and issues with numbers alone. At the time I was teaching, and I continue to teach a course on health issues of children and adolescents, and I was struggling to find stories that spoke to a number of youth experiences in one cohesive volume. So we decided that we were going to do it. We're going to embark on this project, and together we're going to create a collection of stories. And so we did. In developing this book, we asked many questions about the experiences of children. Some of these questions were, how do we define and construct childhood? How is childhood experienced at the intersection of race, class, gender, and geographies? And how do stories help us make sense of and center youth experiences? And these are just a few of many other questions that we asked of ourselves as editors and authors, and that we asked of the other authors who contributed. But to help set the stage for tonight's discussion, I like to focus on the first question, which we don't think about often, I think, is how do we define and construct childhood, and to what end? So the answer, of course, really depends on what informs your perspective. Very often we start with personal experiences. We all have emotionally laden memories of our childhood, usually in relation to the time and space in which our childhood took place. So for me, it was the 1980s, for example. I consider it the best childhood era, of course, coming of age between the analog and the digital. I had a transnational and a bilingual childhood. I lived and grew up in Washington Heights, but at other points, I also lived in Ecuador. I remember riding on the back of pickup trucks with cousins, fire hydrant summers, drinking piraguas, graffiti subway trains, crack cocaine vials on city sidewalks, trying to break dance. I remember it was a big thing, trying to break dance in the 80s. I remember wearing LA gear and collecting garbage pail kids. I also remember translating for my mom during parent-teacher conferences. I was an excellent student. I remember walking to school in 2 feet of snow because there were no snow days for us. I remember it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are at? And these memories I share with friends when we reminisce about childhood, but in these casual conversations, they're more nostalgic, and they don't really get at the holistic context of childhood experiences. And these childhood experiences, of course, are situated in the social, political, and economic context of the times. The economic and labor policies that impacted my family's circumstances, the education policies that shaped my schooling experiences and academic trajectory, and those of my peers in very specific ways. The exclusion we experience in schools, but also in general by virtue of being Black and brown, working class kids, or children of immigrants. The access or lack thereof that we had to resources in our community, our connections to others, our sense of safety, and then ultimately how we negotiated our world given these factors. But my childhood was not the dominant American childhood story that we often hear about or think about or read about. And therefore, my childhood story becomes a marginalized one. So when Ben and I started to work on this collection, we made a commitment and we aimed to give voice to the marginalized stories. These are stories that challenge normative paradigms of childhood, that challenge value-free universal notions of childhoods moving through predictable developmental trajectories. We recognize that children and youth have varied experiences at the intersections of race, class, gender, and geographies. We recognize that today's youth are living in a world of extreme and widening inequality, of rapid climate change, and uncharted technological advances. They're living in a world of existential threats, unprecedented access to knowledge, increased surveillance, and forced global migrations. They're living through the consequences of neoliberalism and racism. Their experiences are complex and childhoods are political. And in contesting old paradigms and centering counter narratives, this book is informed by integrating 2 perspectives to help us explore the experiences of children. So we used the ecological perspectives and the more recent social study of childhood. Taking an ecological perspective, we look at the children and their environment, the transactions that take place between them. That is transactions with peers and families and law and policy, culture and society. Then through the social study of childhood, which is an interdisciplinary approach, we pushed ourselves to challenge the notion of universal childhoods in favor of more contextualized ways of knowing about their experiences. This framework is concerned with children as social actors who construct and interact with their world beyond biological and social processes, and it considers that childhoods are shaped equally by historical, geographic, cultural, racial, political, and economic factors. And the social study of childhood is guided by 2 significant tenets. First, that children are beings in their own right in the here and now. And this means that they have collective interests and rights, that children are knowing and they are active, and whose voices are really critical to the discourse and inquiry and practice that impact their lives. Second, children's lived experiences are central to representations of diverse childhoods. Those tenets compel us to look at the narrative and storytelling to reach these aims of the book, to understand the lived experiences of children and youth. So I'll now turn over to Ben so that he can tell us a little bit more about the power of narratives and storytelling.
Thank you, Mery, and thank you, everyone. So great to be here. You know, one of the reasons that it's great to actually be in class with people, in the room with people. I remember walking into the office one day and saw Mery had like four ethnographies sitting on her desk from the library. And I was like, oh, this is and the conversation grows from there. And it's a conversation about growing up and the stories we tell about growing up. My daughter and I, 18-year-old daughter, walked in. I think we got our 16th COVID test this morning, walked in the snow. And I was telling her about the panel, and I was saying, I don't know that people are hearing the narratives of youth. They're still not. And she said, well, it's like the Bowie song from the Breakfast Club. They think, so, these children that you spit on, they try to change their world. They're immune to your consultations. They're quite aware of what they're going through. And yet they may be aware of it, but are we? And that's always the question. I started an academic talk by quoting David Bowie, but I don't know that we are aware. And I think that's what I'm sort of struggling with. I think about narrative. One narrative kept coming to my head all day as I was prepping for this. In 1988, Paula Treichner wrote, and I'll paraphrase, the AIDS crisis intersects with multiple competing narratives. Now, again, I like that expression. The AIDS crisis intersects with these competing narratives. And lately, narrative is almost an overused word, but I do think about the idea that we have these intersecting narratives, right? Like a lot of intersections around our culture, they're competing narratives. These are narratives with multiple points of view. In the United States right now at our college, there's immigrant narratives, outsider, insider narratives. There's any number of categories of narratives that we're looking at. And yet, I don't know that we know enough about them. I think about the narratives of childhood, the space between here and there, between where we've been going. Childhood's the story adults make up about themselves, says Adam Phillips. I think about the narratives of youth right now. And I don't know that we know what's the official narrative versus the narrative that kids are feeling at 2 a.m. when they've been at home for 2 days. And as lovely as we all are as parents, I know that people would rather not be around us all the time. They'd rather be around their peers. And I think about those isolating feelings that those kids are sometimes having. And what are those unofficial narratives, right? Official narrative, kids are safer at home than with an epidemic. And I am not questioning, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Be safe, public health. But I know that it isn't easy. And we're going into 1 year of this loveliness. And my daughter is a freshman at LaGuardia. I know this is what she wanted freshman year, was to spend a whole year at home with mom and dad instead of being with the FAME kids at the School of Performing Arts. So it's a challenge. And so I think about the narratives that we tell to make sense of our lives, to give our lives meaning. And I think about the narratives that Mery and I talked about growing up, and the embellished narratives, the narratives that are more fun when you retell a story about it as opposed to what really happened. You embellish on the narrative. And my mentors at grad school all said it's okay to embellish from time to time, as long as you differentiate between narrative and historic truth. I think about starting to study narratives as a history student at undergrad and tracing the alternate narratives that Holocaust survivors traced. And they changed. And every time you tell an oral history, you embellish in a different part of it. And that's part of oral histories. That's part of what Homer talked about. Didn't talk about. That's part of the Odyssey. People retell stories in different kinds of ways. I think about studying oral history. Martin said, we study oral history to retrace events when evidence is scarce, to revisit history. But this is the one that blew me away: to collect data to paint a picture of biopsychosocial functioning. So again, I was at first thinking these are just narratives. I'm collecting a 2-hour oral history with somebody. Then I realized you can assess narratives by looking at biopsychosocial functioning traced within that story. And I went to my HUBSI class at University of Chicago and started looking and interpreting all my AIDS narratives as data points. And that blew me away. It's like all of a sudden I've got a narrative that I can interpret, not just as a historical document, but as a narrative that reflects resilience, as Bertram Kohler talked about at University of Chicago, reflected social conditions, as Clifford Shaw talked about with his oral histories. And that was so exciting. And I'm still excited by that. And I still love collecting oral histories. It's the primary part of my work right now, is collecting oral histories. So I'll tell you a couple of mine for the book, for the essay for the book, then we'll trace it on to everyone else. I wanted to look at service providers who work with youth. And so I looked at 3 service providers. One, Kate Barnhart, who works with LGBT homeless youth, John Walsh, who works with Streetworks Project with homeless youth, and Sasha Altman de Bruhl, who started the Icarus Project, reflecting on his childhood as being institutionalized as a kid in the Lower East Side. So I'll quote, Sasha described feelings of being lost in his own life. I came back to New York and it crashed right into my childhood, said de Bruhl. All those feelings, all the teenage stuff that I had, of feeling like I wasn't legit, that I wasn't hardcore enough as all of my friends who had rougher lives, that I wasn't like a real person. All that stuff hit me hard. I basically created a whole narrative for myself as a freight train riding person without a past. And I wanted to die. I remember I would walk through Tompkins Square Park and I was so suicidal that all I could do was think about was hanging from all the blossoming trees. This was during the years right before the global justice movement was on its rise. He traveled on freight trains to and from the West Coast. And at what point after the Battle of Seattle in 1999, he wrote, he said, the final straw came with me after I spent a month in LA County jail in a psychiatric wing, being held down and being shot up with antipsychotic drugs. When I recovered from the experience and put my life back together, I realized that even though the society was crazy, I was more sensitive than other people, and I really needed to take care of myself. I was still part of that anarchist punk community, and I had to column in a magazine that people read, and I started writing about mental health. And he's now a service provider working with, coping with those challenges. Final couple of words. John Walsh, who is a service provider for 18 years at Streetworks Project, he wrote about the challenge of working with his population over the years. Walsh had to say goodbye to many of his clients who left the world too early. I recently had 2 die who were both long-term people and my own clients for many years until they died. These moments really fucked me up. He told me about one client whom he described as a shining star, who he knew for 12 years. This client had contracted HIV very early in his life and often refused to take medication. Welsh said, he died of straight up homophobia, internalized homophobia, a social toxin is my belief. I'd visit him in the hospital where he was sick, and he used to tell me how he felt like dying because he couldn't accept himself, and how he actually was dying. He realized he was himself too young to die, and I could see how he felt a new sympathy and empathy that I wish he'd had years before. So these stories show us so much. The thing I loved about doing these 3 interviews was each of them, I hadn't known that 2 of the 3 had their own childhood issues with institutionalization and drug use. So these service providers that are working with these populations had a lot to tell. I want to conclude by thinking in 1900, Sigmund Freud suggests that the stories about our lives offer countless insights. One can certainly see a few in the life stories traced throughout this chapter. Each points to a nagging problem absent a larger solution. It's clear that more has to be done to engage youth lost to services. And while personal narratives are thought to elicit support from social actors, the question remains if these narratives can transform public indifference into social action for those in need. Too few providers are doing enough to respond to the complex realities of runaway homeless youth, or for that matter, to respect their choices and challenges. As a result, far too many wayward youth find themselves at arm's length from services, spending their nights on subway trains, doubled up on couches, locked up in psych institutions, or trembling in the cold. Thank you for letting me take a little time to talk, Mery. Appreciate it. Look forward to hearing from everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So now I'll turn over to the contributing authors. We're going to start with Erica, but I wanted to share with you some of the questions that we asked the authors to think about. So first, we asked them to share a brief summary of their chapter and why they felt this particular topic that they were tackling in the chapter was so important especially to those who are concerned with children and youth. I asked them to share some theoretical framework or research method that they used in the chapter, and also how they feel narratives help us learn more about the youth issue that they research in ways that quantitative methods alone are not able to do, or maybe that they complement quantitative methods. How do narratives center youth voices and center them as actors in their world and highlight their agency? So we'll start with Erica, who will share a bit about her chapter.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone from Northeast Philadelphia. It's great to be here. And like many, I was multitasking today. I have 4 kids, none of whom were in school. One is an infant, so she couldn't be in school. But also working from home. I'm an academic and a psychotherapist, and I actually see a few of my Doctorate of Social Work students here in the chat. So nice to see you guys. I was raised by a mother who wove narrative into the fabric of my life. And I grew up assuming that everybody had an inner narrator. And I think actually where we are right now in time is a place where we're almost making fun of that, right? There's a narrator over our shoulders, always expecting the worst, always telling us insulting things, or always telling and retelling and co-creating our stories along with us. And I think about the work of William James, who often talked about the observer self or the second self, this second self who is part of us that stands and narrates from the background, always engaging, sometimes mocking. And so for me, I really grew up with a narrator. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, so I actually have an intrusive narrator in my life. And yet the value of storytelling was so strong for me. The idea of understanding my own life journey through story was a thought that just became kind of a normal for me in my childhood. So I took for granted that not everybody grew up with narrative, but there's a desire to tell stories. I can think of a moment when I was recovering from an eye surgery and I woke up and my mom had the Odyssey and she just sat there reading the Odyssey to me. She loved to read mythology. She loved to engage me in stories. So I'm literally coming out of anesthesia and there's Greek myth right there. And you know, it was a privileged, in many ways, a privileged and idyllic childhood. And yet for me, I grew up with death really haunting me at every turn. Loss has always been present for me. And I'm certainly grateful right now that my children's lives during the pandemic have only been peripherally touched. There's been no major deaths. They've had a loss of school routine, a loss of normalcy and socialization, but nobody near us has died. And nobody near me died in my childhood. And yet loss was always, always on my mind. My brain has always been plagued with an existential angst that is so immediate and sickening that when I was a little girl, it would make me physically ill. So for me, there's never been a moment of pure happiness without a sliver of brokenness, a reflection of death, smiling seductively behind it, reminding me, narrating, none of this lasts forever. So what was the rational thing for me to do when I decided to become a social worker? I ran toward and not away from death. And so that's where my chapter begins, at the nexus of social work and social work working in end-of-life contexts. For me, I wanted to unmask my greatest fear as it happened and figure out how to live with it and its eventuality. And I tell the story of a young woman, a teenager who was dying of a brain tumor, and how her life transformed me and how her death shattered me. And yet in its aftermath, left an adolescent brother who could not decide who he wanted to be. So the method of autoethnography and case study, and let me tell you also as a social worker, narrative case study is what we do. Assessing and evaluating and helping people create and recreate their stories and make sense from it. This is what we do. So this was a really good fit for me as a method for this chapter. It allowed me to explore the multiple dimensions of identity in my experience with these youth. So in this chapter, I explore my identity, those of my patient and her brother, and their roles within my world as they existed as teen, as patient, as trigger of self-reflection, and more. And I engage not from a lens of illness and pathology, but wonder as my patient's grieving brother worked to construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct his identity. So in line with the social studies of childhood theoretical orientation, we need to acknowledge that so frequently youth are the subject of an adult lens. They're analyzed from a grown-up's perspective, expectation, and sometimes even rigid stage-based understandings of childhood. And yet if we really want to get to know youth, especially teens, as passionate, intriguing, rebellious, and curious people, we need to look at them through a lens that acknowledges their ability to try on impermanent identities and coping styles, especially in the wake of loss, as they grapple with that ultimate question, who am I? And that answer, who am I, is always changing depending on context, socioeconomic status, resources, relationships, and so much more. And I can relate, with death ever chasing my conscious mind. As a teen, I wondered who I would be and who I would become. And I could never shake that morbid inner narrator, inner monologue. And I found my way, but I had to move through multiple shifting identities and meanings to get there. So what if we looked at childhood development in the same way? What about our understanding of how children construct and co-create meaning from loss, with an outcome being a sense of self that is flexible and unique? It's something to think about. I mean, the pandemic has changed our lives for good. It has changed loss for good. It has brought loss into our living room and onto our news feeds. Death has been invited into our homes on a deeply intimate and bold level. We cannot deny its presence and its eventuality. So now more than ever, we need to bear witness to these tremendous losses and suffering, but also view death as a catalyst for personal growth and something that can inspire helping professionals to challenge how we relate to the bereaved. When we do that, we can see teens as multifaceted, nuanced actors within larger reciprocal systems that shape and reshape self-understandings. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica. We're going to move along and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss each other's process and stories. We're now going to Trevor.
Hi, good evening. It's interesting because I'm like, man, should I mention something about my own childhood? But I could at least, this make me want to mention like my social work background, which is where I started to have the kind of the interest in youth. I'd written a book about teenagers in alternative to incarceration programs. And there was like this particular like piece, almost like it's like a sub thing within a chapter where I was talking about like a neighborhood as a panopticon. If you don't know what a panopticon is, it was a prison designed by this British philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. The whole idea of it was being panopticon kind of breaks down into like all seeing institution. It was a design for a prison, and prison was originally designed so that you could take individual prisoners and put them in a cell and you could observe their behavior and try to fix them, try to correct them. But the thing that came out of the panopticon has become this metaphor of surveillance, of watching, of people continuously watching you. And I had noticed that while I was doing that research, I'm like, man, there's certain neighborhoods that are like, it's almost like they're prisons. They kind of act the same. It has the same boundaries. There's like the police officers kind of act like corrections officers. And so I kind of just like built off that idea. And so the title of my chapter was Neighborhood Surveillance and the Prison Assembly Line. It's a play off the school to prison pipeline. But I wanted to focus on that neighborhood surveillance. So in New York State, 90% of the prison population in New York State is filled or is fed by 15 neighborhoods from New York City. And so these kids that grow up in those 15 neighborhoods, I'd focused on that in my first book, but then also started to focus on for this particular chapter, you know, that like these kids are going through something completely different from the rest of society, from the rest of the city. And they are being surveilled in a way as if they're in prison. This is almost kind of a play on there's this French sociologist, his name is Loic Lecointe, and he'd written this article once about how prisons are like surrogate ghettos, and ghettos are like surrogate prisons, and they're kind of like one and the same in a sense. And for this, I just kind of wanted to talk about how like the criminal justice system in New York State really tends to focus heavily on those 15 neighborhoods, the surveillance of those neighborhoods, the policing of those neighborhoods, the arresting of people in those neighborhoods. What's the name of this organization? This few years back, this organization called the Justice Mapping Center was talking about $1 million blocks in New York City, meaning that like from one traffic light to the next traffic light, the New York State Department of Corrections will spend in some neighborhoods $9 million per year to incarcerate people from one traffic light to another traffic light, one block. They would call them these $1 million blocks. So you have these kids who, these children who, they're constantly under surveillance. So of course they're going to have different childhoods. And to kind of talk about that relationship between our criminal justice system and the neighborhoods that these kids grew up in. So for this chapter, I decided to do some ethnography and focus on 3 individuals. Their names are Jim, Sean, Duke, and Fife. When I talked with them, they were adults, but they were incarcerated from these neighborhoods as youth, and they'd served their prison sentences. And kind of, you know, I just wanted to see what their experience was like trying to reintegrate back into society. Can they reintegrate back into society? And in most cases, they're reintegrating right back into one of those 15 neighborhoods, which puts them under immediate surveillance as young adults. And so, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. So to connect this to the whole conceptualization of narratives, and why this topic in particular deals with youth is, well, for one, it has to do a lot with just opportunities and opportunity structure. And these kids have an uphill climb. It's real easy to get arrested in their neighborhoods. Very easy. All they got to do is walk outside. It's real difficult to finish school and do the things that they're supposed to do. And so like this is, you know, the focus on youth is incredibly important here. And obviously the method chosen is ethnography. It's funny amongst colleagues how qualitative people love that they're qualitative. You know, we love the fact that we gather stories because stories are the things that people want to read. Stories are the things that our respondents love to tell. I mean, I'd written another book about con artists and criminals, and people are like, how did you get them to talk to you? I'm like, are you kidding me? People love to share their stories. Love to share their stories. You tell them that you're writing a book and they're like, can I be in your book? You know, so it's real great. And in order to, those narratives obviously give a different picture than quantitative data would. You know, me talking about those 15 neighborhoods and 90%, like I love working with and making reference to quantitative data a lot, quite a bit. But obviously those numbers don't tell the story. It's like to hear it from somebody, to hear it from a primary source is incredibly important. So, you know, I learned about all 3 of my respondents. All of them were like, they admittedly were like all hard knuckleheaded kids growing up in rough neighborhoods in New York. And they were all like, yeah, I made some pretty knuckleheaded mistakes. And you get to, you know, through the narrative, you get to see like that, you know, we're all, I read somewhere that we're all psychopaths at 16, 16 years old. And I kind of believe that to be true. And, you know, like, because we all do like some of the worst stuff that we will do in our lives will be around 16 years old, and how like we don't really have a society that allows for those mistakes. Those kids get pulled right into the system, and then they perpetually get become a part of that system. You know, 80% of all men, this is for the United States, 80% of all men that go to prison, when they come back out, 80% of them will recidivate within 3 years. 80% of them will commit new crimes and go back to prison. So once you enter that system, it's so difficult to get back out of that system. And also, you know, the importance of narrative is really does get down to their individual agencies. You can hide behind stats. You could talk about becoming a statistic. you can't hide from your personal story. So once you can get a personal narrative out of somebody, it sheds a lot of light on the numbers. The numbers begin to make sense. How could these things occur? And you gather a few stories and you're like, okay, I could start to see what's going on here. It's unfortunate that it played out each way like this for each of these people, but that story is everything. That story pieces everything together. And again, I don't know if I'm supposed to get too much into the chapter. Actually, really two of the people that I spoke with have these like incredible success stories because they were able to pull themselves out. But also at the same time, I try to showcase how difficult it was for them to pull out of that system. And the third guy that I interviewed was still he was fresh out of prison. So he was still kind of caught in that cycle, just trying to hold still so he doesn't get caught up in anything. But otherwise, I love qualitative work. I love ethnography, and I love hearing people's personal stories. It makes for good reading. So hopefully I didn't go over. Thank you.
No, perfect, Trevor. It's true. And I'll just say that, stories really like draw you in, like make you care about particular issues. So we'll get into that afterwards. And last but not least, Stephen Rushik.
It's so wonderful to hear stories and perspectives on youth from so many different topical perspectives and different disciplines too. I think hearing them together gives you an even richer sense of what children's lives are like, and that's certainly one takeaway you get from reading the book, which I think is one of its goals. But today, from the same seat in my bedroom, I was teaching my immigration class, and we discussed public narratives about immigrants in the United States. And the main stories that we see about them in films and in news and things like that are highly caricatured, including those who are crafted by those who are anti-immigrant and those who are pro-immigrant. So I think sharing rich stories of undocumented Americans can really problematize those narrow framings. So I'll start with just a little bit of sort of background on immigration and immigrants in the United States, and then get into my own positionality and some of the stories. So today, nearly 1 in 4 immigrants in the United States lacks legal status, but about 1 in 19 US workers are undocumented. These immigrants have grown roots in their communities, and they're also raising families, right? There's a richness to even that story so far. Nearly half of all undocumented immigrants today are parents of minors, and more than 16.5 million people live in what we call mixed status households, with people who are of different immigration statuses. Amongst the children of undocumented immigrants, more than 4.5 are native-born citizens, and more than 1 million are undocumented. The children are undocumented. And more than that number, more than 1 million, are now young adults who have been in the United States since childhood. And so as I speak about the stories of some of the youths who I worked with in my research, I think it's important to reflect on this quote from Audre Lorde, that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And so here we'll hear what kind of overlapping issues come to play important roles in youth lives as they move through childhood and then out of childhood. And for this chapter, I highlight the biographies of 4 young undocumented people who I've worked with for over the longue durée, over a sort of long period of time. Leo and Luis are 2 young men who are brothers. And then I worked with Aracelis and Alma, who are not sisters, but who are 2 young women. And today, how do they fit into this overall picture of immigrants and immigrant youth? The 4 people I worked with are part of the 1.5 generation, meaning that they were born in another country, but they were socialized in the United States, and they all attended American high schools. all of them also entered the United States by crossing the border without authorization. And they're part of the 2 million plus people who have come as kids without other authorization and are growing up or have already grown up in the United States. And these narratives of Luis, Leo, Aracelis, and Alma, they're crafted from spending time with them in a gazillion places, in and out of their classes, in varied social spaces, from their family breakfast table to church, to times with friends in parks and parties, from my position as a former teacher in one of the schools that they had attended. Alma, I worked with her for a minimum of 3 years, and then Luis up to 12 years. So these are people who, at a certain point, they feel part of your family. And I followed them from early high school into their mid-20s and beyond. And so this adds to, I think, the research process, right? Overlapping in time with their own coming of age, and working with them through difficult decision-making points, and being able to highlight what happens without some of that bias that comes from telling your story after the fact. And I think in their narratives, we see their sense of agency, and of course its limitations, right, given their legal status and other things that these young people experienced as they grew into new understandings of their legal and their social positions, right? Today, more than ever before, the legal status divide is really at the crux of what differentiates how the children of immigrants experience everyday life. So that was certainly foregrounded in the stories that we co-constructed, but also things like gendered expectations and gender roles were really important. The transnational possibilities that they had as people who have family both in Mexico and in the United States. And so those give opportunities, but also test these youth. And, I think the pandemic has brought us all an appreciation for, being able to strategize around uncertainty, right? And deep uncertainty. And, that would be no surprise to these young people who first had uncertainty from family separation when their parents left to migrate to the United States, and they eventually came later. But especially around how to strategize and re-strategize around how to fulfill their dreams, right? And like many youths in their school, they aspire to achieve educationally, but also to fit in, to give upward mobility their best shot. And given that they're all members of immigrant families, I think one sort of narrative that was really important within their families was what scholars call the immigrant bargain. This understanding between immigrant parents and their kids that the children should redeem the sacrifice of their parents in immigrating, right? They gave up their homeland, their many times their social positions, their social status, and those kind of things. And that sacrifice is often communicated as being tied to providing a better life for their kids, right? So how do these different issues and institutions, from family to school to work, how do they create complex stories for the people who I featured in the chapter? And I think that the chapter benefits from having developed it with them, right? Having spent so much time with them, I crafted sort of an initial draft and then shared it with the young people who, gave me feedback on it, told me to highlight certain things weren't represented as they would. So I, worked with them on how to do those differently. But then also what I bring as an academic to the narrative, which is, which dynamics are created by structural factors, things that might be out of their day-to-day purview. To what extent do laws and immigration policies shape their major life decisions? And, how do gender roles shape their directions and things like that? So as children, they are included in schools, right? Undocumented youths are able to go to school as other children are, as a result of the Plyler versus Doe Supreme Court decision. And so they're included, but they're included in a way that's not maybe full inclusion as it is for many children. Today in my immigration course, we talked about how, negative stereotypes of, Colombian or Italian ethnics as being tied to criminality, right, as mobsters or, in drug sales and things like that, create stereotypes that other teens use to tease, right, and stereotype even their own friends, right. And so the chapters get into things like that that I think are, they end up being quite poignant, where, Luis reflected on his father's role in his life, and he said, he sacrificed for me. He was able to give me money when I needed it the most to be able to continue school when I was excluded from financial aid. Leo, his brother, who was maybe less engaged in school, was part of a crew, right? Not a sort of formal gang involvement, but a crew on this something a little bit more informal. And so he says, I wasn't part of the bad stuff, right? It was just more about, being cool and maybe being delinquent, being outside of school. And it was actually his family that brought him out of that, right? That helped him to pressure him to get his own money. And he said, I wanted my own money. And so he got jobs moving boxes in a school nearby. And the bosses liked the kind of work I did and asked me to work full time. And it was he had this sort of comeback story that he told himself about, being able to provide for his parents and their rent, and then later being able to provide for his own family, even though he, was aware of some of the limitations of his legal status. But he said things like, I'm working, I got my family, we have an apartment, I'm all right. Whereas his brother, Luis, was drawn into professional fields. And he was studying at CUNY and was having a really hard time of it because of the very high cost for undocumented students. And he said, when I decided to study architecture, I knew I couldn't stay there. It was so expensive. It was a waste of time and money. And so here we see the complexities of stories for young people who are featured in my chapter, where their transnational resources become really important, right? Luis moves back to Mexico, manages to get his bachelor's there, and eventually ends up working in his hometown as an architect. And maybe to sort of wrap things up for time's sake, there's a sort of poignant place where you see the passing of time and how working with these young people for a very long time, you can see the changing ways that they make meaning and the ways that they interpret the world, and also how they come together. So, 2 weeks ago, Leo and Luis's grandfather passed away because of COVID, and their father, who lives and works in New York, couldn't even go back to see his father's funeral. But it was certainly very meaningful for them that Luis himself was able to be there as someone who was in Mexico who could represent the New York family at that important moment. So in the stories, there's both tragedy and a triumph, and moving away from sort of simple narratives about who undocumented youths are, whether it's one that's criminalizing or one that's painting them as dreamers, as being all American and sort of ideal, doesn't map onto the reality of our lives, right? And the narratives in the chapter, fit certain parts of each of those framings, but also represent the complexity of our lives. And I think that is something that can bring more humanity to big public narratives, but also to the people, the students who are reading these chapters and discussing them. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Now we're going to go to the follow-up questions. Ben is going to moderate this part.
I mean, look, I know that it's late and it's snowy out. but it's so interesting. So let's take a few minutes to unpack this. I mean, Trevor taking this theoretical frame around the panopticon, Foucault's, the prison, right? And the urban jungle. I mean, Stephen, crossing a border, right? That what a narrative, right? This, how do people navigate crossing a border? Erica, autoethnography. And I know the struggle of like, when it becomes just a novel and it disappears, like you get stuck in, like I always got lectured on, don't do autoethnography because you're going to get stuck. And I think they were right. It's a little hard to get out once you're in there. So let's take a minute to talk about reflexivity. Like, I think that when we talk about narratives, I mean, Mery I love Mery starts off her story with talking about the story of Lucas. Do you mind if we mention, like, she goes to see she says she's good with kids, first day in class, and the kid, she's like, let's play a game. And the boy's like, I'm out of there. And I loved that Mery took that moment of I'm out of there. And she said, from 3 different theoretical perspectives, why would that kid run? And I love that you used your use of self to reflect on what was the other, what was the other thinking? And ultimately that's what narrative is all about, is what is the other, the self and the other, what is the other thinking? So let's talk a little bit about reflexivity. How do we reflect on ourselves and then let stories grow out of that process? Anybody want to start? I mean, we can just go around. Yep.
I mean, I just appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that we are living in a society right now in a moment of echo chamber. And so I think that there's not a lot of personal responsibility, reflexivity, and self-reflection happening. So I think it's really important to find spaces within our practice to narrate to others that we feel safe with. Because in my chapter, when I talk about identity, I think we're still also shifting identities as practitioners. No one client gets the same me. And it's a dance, right? Like you're reading off of the person you're working with, and depending on who's there. So I think the challenge is finding someone really, really, really safe to express some of these thoughts from your inner monologue that come up, and to almost examine yourself as subject and object, and to put yourself kind of on display to do that. That I think really takes a lot of vulnerability and humility. And I find that the more I do that, the more I'm able to tolerate others with differences of opinion. Like I'm really trying now, just in my work on social media, in my work in the community, to try to really understand the perspectives of people who should be my enemy, who depict me in one light, and who kind of set up these false binaries. And I don't think I can do that without being a clinician that also reflects upon those aspects in myself.
So good. So good. Harry Stack Sullivan said, there's no neutral observation. We are all informing the observation in the room. Trevor, I see you might have some intruders. So what are you thinking?
It's funny because I'm like, can I pass? Because my kids are fighting pretty hard behind me. But I'll just, whatever.
Duly noted, friend. I mean, we're all in it. There's drums downstairs here. So
oh my God, you should have heard the
judgment.
noise a second ago. It was crazy. This is making me think a lot about kind of ethnography in general. How, my students are asked, like, what is ethnography? And like, one of the ways that I describe it is like, it's your experience in a new environment. It's like, it's you writing about the 5 senses. You writing about what you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you hear. But it's still about, it kind of boils down to you, right? You're the vessel, if you will. Right. And, like just the things that I'm interested in, again, both of these, the first book that I mentioned and how that was focused on teenagers in alternative to incarceration programs, my focus on these, again, adults, young adults who were formerly incarcerated as young people. That has a lot to do with my just personal experiences as a social worker. Before I got into academia, I did social work working exactly with teenagers who were in alternative to incarceration programs. And speaking in narratives, there's this parable, I forget where this comes from, but there's like a parable about this guy that like dives into a river to save people, and he keeps seeing people coming downstream. He keeps diving in and saving them. This should sound familiar to a lot of people, right?
The organizing narrative, yeah.
And I went upstream to do academia. I wanted to see why people were falling into the water in the first place. And so, yeah, a lot of this is tied to, I guess, some of my childhood, some of the empathy that I was able to gather from my own childhood experiences, knowing what it was like to be. I mean, I grew up in a decent home, but growing up being a child of the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of, or I should say, there was very little supervision. So we got to do a lot of bad things without
Fun things,
parents
hopefully.
watching. A lot of bad things, and that helps me to understand the clients that I had as social work clients, and it also helps me to understand my respondents as just, there's nothing crazy or odd about them. They're humans. They're like all of us. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mery.
So I think like one of the things that struck me in writing the chapter is how much I wanted to have other people care about the things that I cared about, and that as I was in it, I needed to speak about my own experiences in growing up as a child of immigrants, as growing up in a working class family, and my experiences in school as well. And so I often had like this experience that I was one of the few that made it, right? I overcame these challenges, and it's sort of what Stephen was speaking to, is like we as a society, we write these like narratives, these like binary narratives as these are people who are successful and they're good and they made it, and these are people who are not, and they hold that responsibility for their outcomes. So in my chapter, I used testimonial, which is an approach of really using the self as someone who bore witness to these schooling experiences. But then I also brought in my experiences as somebody who went back into the schools as a practitioner and who was working with children and other practitioners who were going through some of the similar things that I experienced as a child. But kids are still being put into these categories of deficient or sort of unable or incapable, or that they're lacking something, without really understanding all of the social structures that bring children to particular struggles in schools and how other people see them, and that a lot of their circumstances in schools are by social design. They're very policy driven, right? And multiple levels of policy. So the process was very emotional for me, because I had to like put myself, like Erica said, like I had to be very vulnerable and share my own experiences, but also use that lens in trying to understand how we're talking and thinking about kids, and how we're trying to help them, or maybe we create barriers for them in their schooling experiences. So that was my 2 cents for that question.
And it was actually, I found it very raw and very moving, the way you opened up. I've worked with you for like a decade, and to hear things I just hadn't known until I read it on a piece of paper. I think, and hopefully the Queer Futuro students see that and benefit from reading that. We don't have to be a hero or a savior. We can be ourselves. And I think that's really important. Stephen, like, how do you, like, you knew these people for so long. How did you maintain distance and presence at the same time? I mean, when you're an interviewer, you give professional courtesy friendship. Like, how did you maintain distance and friendship at the same time as you did that?
Probably not very well.
Yeah.
I think it was, in some ways it was easier in the very beginning. I was a teacher in New York City schools until 2008, and that's when I entered graduate school. So I started work immediately in 2 different high schools where I had taught. So students still sort of saw me as a teacher, and I had been a teacher and the soccer coach. So I was, and I had done sort of extra programs on the weekends. And so I had a sort of multi-stranded, I would say like a multi-stranded relationship with a lot of students. And I started a mentorship program in one of the schools. And so I'd had this it was kind of easy for me to take on this mentor / teacher persona that, facilitates building relationships and makes it really easy, or much easier, I think, than it would have been otherwise to build relationships with not just the kids, but their parents. and to, you know, to be in spaces and have a certain, you know, that sort of obvious role, right? That everyone could say. They would call me, oh, el maestro, right? Ah, el maestro está aquí. You know, I was always maestro el profe, right? Instead of, you know, Steven or something like that. A lot of times, even though I'd be like, you know, I'm Steven, there's a, you know, maestro. So I think that kind of positionality helped me in the beginning. And, you know, over time, I think I thought the project was going to end after a couple of years. And then it's really hard, right? DACA started in 2012, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And that was like, okay, everything that I've been studying has been sort of, you know, turned upside down. And so I kept on, you know, working with young people. At the same time, there's sort of an important detail here. This is part of a project that was comparative, that looked at what it was like for young people without documents in Paris to come of age. So I was sort of comparing people in each city. And you know, over time, I become someone who, you know, in the beginning, maybe I was someone who could help with how to write an essay to pass an exam, right? Those kind of things, to being someone who can help you with your DACA application.
Wow.
In Paris, I was able to work with people and help them regularize their status in different ways. So the role, I think, changed, right, over time. And now I'm not sure what I am. I used to say I was like a tío, I was like an uncle or something to a lot of people. And maybe that's the best word. But of course, we have kids now, and they have kids now. So it's both an obstacle to maintain that relationship with them, but then we bring the kids together and we go to you know, the zoo together, stuff like that, you know, the research side of the relationship, I think, has eased away.
And that's something that seems, I mean, how do you avoid that? I became, one of my interviewees died right as I was finishing my PhD, and he was like an 88-year-old guy in the Stonewall riots. And I just remember I gave a job talk, and I was just like, when I interview, he's dying, right? Like, and it was beyond a subject. It was somebody I'd known for a decade and was profoundly moving. So, and I want to say thank all of you guys for sharing this bit of yourselves and your vulnerability. We have to be reflexive in sharing these stories. Let's take a few minutes before we wrap up. And I know everybody needs to go about their business, but I do think the topic in this period, with kids home from school, with kids in the winter inside of the houses, what is the challenge for narrative? I mean, Mery, almost like this is our next step, right? It's like narratives around the COVID period. You know, one of the kids on the block said in the summer, the people that don't skateboard don't have friends, because the people that skateboard go to the parks and hang out. But the people that don't, we're in home with the screens. So let's take a few, I wonder if any of you guys just could talk about either parenting or what your sense of how childhood changes. I could not imagine as a hyperactive, and I say I was diagnosed to the 70s as, that was a technical term, hyperactive child. And if I had somebody said, stay home, that wouldn't have gone well, you know? So anyway, I'd love to hear from you guys as we wrap up.
Well, you know, it's really interesting. I don't know if many people know who are here, but Stephen and I are married, and we're like in two separate parts of the apartment right now. And our kids are in a room with their abuelita, and we're in intergenerational home. So that really helps our process as a family. But you know, one thing that we have to think about is that we have these ideas and expectations about milestones that children are supposed to achieve, or levels that they're supposed to reach. But we really need to take a step back. I mean, this word supposed to, or should, it needs to exit our language at some point. And we need to think about where kids are right now. We're in a pandemic, and we need to consider what is most important in the pandemic. Is it figuring out that Common Core math, which let me just tell you how much I hate. Or, you know, is it helping children continue some semblance of peer relationships? Today, as an example, I have to tell you that we were so excited. My daughter was playing with one of her friends, and they've been playing online pretty much the entire day. They've been Zoom playing. And that's their reality. That's how they reconstruct their world and try to make sense of what used to be. It was just that they were doing this at school, they were doing this in person, but how do they then continue to connect to their peers? And kids figure it out, right? We need to figure it out with them, but kids tend to figure it out. I did want to kind of connect to a question that was in the Q&A.
Yeah.
And that I think is also important in this conversation of children in the pandemic is what does narrative practice look like for nonverbal kids? And I think it's important to consider that kids always communicate. People that are nonverbal always communicate in one way or another. And one of the most important ways that children tend to communicate is through play. And I'm going to volley to Ben, who does a lot of work on play. And this is the major way that children are able to make sense of their world, figure out how to interact with others, challenge things that they don't necessarily agree with or feel that aligns with them. But kids are always communicating and they are always creating. How often do you see a kid, I see that you mentioned kids are always singing, they're always drawing. I think between Stephen and I, Stephen does it more. He shares all the drawings that our kids make throughout the year, but there's always communication. And I think it's about us being able to listen to different ways of communicating. So I'll let others speak.
I just want to acknowledge that question came from someone who is actually doing amazing work with children and people across the lifespan, doing equine assisted therapy and equine assisted activity. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is, and this is actually, so this is a student of mine, and we've had a great discussion from her perspective about the love of nature that working with animals and being outdoors creates. And, you know, I think as a parent, I mean, this has been, every subsequent day is the hardest day that it has been, right? So it's like I get through the day and then the next day is even harder, and then I get through it and all you do is pick yourself up and go again the next day. And I think what's interesting, Mery, as you were saying, is kids figure it out. And sometimes when I try to impose my idea of the fix, it's really challenging, right? Like we have one kid who's struggling a bit with just the lack of socialization. And so I'm putting in all of these resources. We've got OT and we've got, you know, school counselor, and, you know, he's well resourced and he's got a type A mom that's going to champion. And what he really needs to do, what I find him doing to help himself cope with this hard time where there's no one to co-regulate with, you know, the way that he would in class, is he's playing in his body. Like he's playing so much in his body around the house. Our house is a disaster, but his sense of just like his kinesthetic intelligence is what I'm seeing coming out. And sometimes it's like totally unbridled and we have to kind of pull him back in. And sometimes it's a matter of doing things dexterity wise with Lego. I mean, but his solution, his fix to the problem is a very different language than what I speak. And I think that, you know, you can have both of those coexisting as long as you have this recognition that your kids are going to try to solve that problem themselves in many different ways. And that's also, like, again, along the lines of humility, that's such a humbling experience to see a 7-year-old working through this, and heartbreaking, right? Like it's still, because he can do the best that he can to solve his own problem within, you know, the limitations that he has, and still being within a 2-parent working from home, like with all of the privilege and help that he has. So there's also the thought of what are we doing for people that don't have these protective factors, like my son. And I don't know about you guys, but that's something that the colder it gets, and seeing the situation in Texas, you know, you can't just play in your body through these situations. So that's something that has really been haunting me lately.
Right on. Trevor, thank you. Thank you.
I'll be brief. I feel like I could speak to both. I know for all the adults, we're waiting for this to be over, for all this to be, and I personally have let go of that phrase. Like,
man,
our kids, it's been a year. We were talking about this before we started recording, right? It's been a year. For our kids, it's been like 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. Like they're so used to it. There was this, I got a 8-year-old daughter, and she, after school, she was like playing with her friends that, outside this playground. And I was like looking, all of them had masks on and all of them were naturally socially distancing. None of the parents were saying anything. And I'm like, geez, they're doing better than us. And it's like, it's almost scary to think about, like, when we put them back into the school that we had in 2019, they might be like, no, I don't want this. It's odd. I also have a son that was nonverbal up until about the age of 6. I wish I could speak to like the field of it and like the expertise on it. I just know it was, in terms of like putting together his story, it was just this constant clue hunt with him, this constantly like trying to piece together the things that he's, like in one moment it's like he's screaming, and then like a moment later it's like, well, he's doing it for a reason. We got to figure out what's going on here. And it's definitely hard, but I would say that there is a story there, even if the narration is coming from the ones that are in closest proximity to them. I don't know if that's a good answer. I don't know if that's an offensive answer. I don't know, but that was just my experience with my son. So that's it.
Maybe I'll just say a short comment. The health pandemic is only one of the pandemics that I think these young people I'm working with are struggling with, and that we're struggling with, as a sort of larger society. There's obviously the deep problems of racism and how that shows up in their lives, and police relations with young people in cities like New York and Paris, which have both been cities where there's been a lot of police brutality, and there's been a lot of pushback in terms of people in the streets. But as the pandemic has progressed, I think there sort of is like a general terribleness for everyone. But maybe it's most acute for people who haven't gotten any money from any stimulus money from the government. They've been ridden out again and again. The city of New York said that they were going to give undocumented residents some support, and haven't done anything about it. At the same time, many of the undocumented, adults that I know are essential workers, right? They're the ones who are out there, who have been out there, hustling because they don't get any help from the social welfare system, and because of being in that system, they've become more more likely to come down with COVID-19, right? Which puts their families, which often live in small spaces where people don't have an extra bedroom where people can go and quarantine, like those things are just not logistically feasible. And so I think that there have been multiple, traumas on a lot of families, not every single family that I know, but certainly on a number of them. And it bears extra work, right? I mean, I haven't been keeping up as good relationships because of the pandemic as maybe I did before. But then in terms of them receiving services, right? Like a number of you have talked about services and how they can be at least part of the solution. And many of these young people, or the young adults who I know who have young kids, they don't feel comfortable, reaching out for services in even in their own neighborhoods, even in a city like New York that is, quote unquote, a sanctuary city. So the challenges are real. I think that's the sort of downer note I want to end on. Yes. Is there's a lot of work for us to do, even beyond the executive actions of President Biden and things like that.
I think I just loved listening and learning from all of you guys. I wish we could keep it going. Mery, I'm going to give you the last word. I want to thank you all. I had a great time, and it was great to put a name to a face for all of you. Thank you. Mery Diaz, Professor Diaz.
All right. Again, just thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. There's so much more that we can say, right? Kids live very complex lives, and as you mentioned, from your own chapters and your own focus on particular issues, what we know is that when we take a step back is that they're not just these singular issues, they're intersecting issues, right? And I think going forward, just to piggyback on what how Stephen was speaking about things, is that these stories are going to be more and more important. We need to hear the specific stories that we don't get to hear on the mainstream basis, right? We need to hear the marginalized stories of kids who are being excluded, or kids who are being left behind by the system, of kids who are not really being taken care of, right, in a collective sense. So I think that stories and narratives are going to become really important in bearing witness to those experiences. So again, thank you very much for participating and joining us tonight. And I wish you well, and I wish you safety, and hopefully we'll get to do this again soon.
Take it on the road, Mery. Thank you, guys. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Peace out.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.